There is a moment most people recognize, even if they have never had a name for it. You are sitting across from someone you care about, a child, a partner, a colleague, a friend, and you are asking them to do something reasonable, something that is clearly in their best interest. You have laid out your case carefully. You have been patient. You have explained the logic, offered the benefits, and made it as easy as possible to say yes. And they say no, or worse, they say nothing. They look at you with that quiet, unmoved expression that tells you the conversation is over, even though you haven't finished talking. They pull back, fold their arms, and in that moment, something shifts between you. The more you push, the more they resist. The louder your reasoning becomes, the more distant they get. And somewhere in the middle of your very reasonable argument, you realize that your very reasonableness is the problem. This is one of the most universal frustrations in human experience, and yet most people treat it as a mystery. They walk away from these moments confused, or irritated, or quietly convinced that the other person is simply being stubborn. They try harder the next time. They sharpen their arguments. They find new evidence. They explain it better. And the same thing happens again. What almost no one stops to ask is this: what if the pushing is the problem? What if the very act of directing someone toward a conclusion, even a correct one, even a kind one, triggers something deep inside them that has nothing to do with the logic of the suggestion itself? What if resistance is not really about the content of what you're saying, but about the experience of being told? Human beings are wired for autonomy. This is not a personality quirk. It is not stubbornness or immaturity or irrationality. It is one of the most fundamental psychological drives that exists in our species. The need to feel that our choices are our own, that our decisions come from within us and not from the pressure of someone else, is as basic as the need to feel safe. When that sense of autonomy is threatened, something inside us pushes back, automatically, sometimes before we are even conscious of it. Psychologists have a name for this reaction. They call it psychological reactance. And understanding it is the beginning of understanding almost everything there is to know about why influence so often fails, and why the most effective forms of persuasion almost never feel like persuasion at all. This audiobook is about that space, the quiet, often invisible territory between influence and control, between guiding someone and pushing them. It is about a phenomenon that has been studied by researchers, used by skilled communicators, and noticed by perceptive parents, leaders, therapists, and negotiators for generations. It is about what is commonly called reverse psychology, though that term barely scratches the surface of what it actually involves. More than that, this is a book about human nature, about why people behave the way they do when they feel directed, controlled, or crowded, about the emotional architecture of resistance, and about how, once you understand that architecture clearly, you begin to see that working with it, rather than against it, is not just more effective. It is more respectful, more honest, and more humane. We are not here to teach you tricks. We are not here to hand you a set of techniques for getting people to do what you want, without them realizing it. What we are here to do is far more interesting and far more useful than that. We are here to help you understand how people actually work. And in doing so, to make you a better communicator, a wiser influencer, and a more thoughtful person in every relationship you hold. Because the truth is, the most powerful thing you can do in any conversation is not to make a stronger case. It is to create the conditions in which someone else can make their own case and arrive, through their own thinking, at the conclusion you were hoping they would reach. That is not manipulation. That is art. And it is an art that, once learned, changes everything. To understand reverse psychology in any deep way, you first need to understand the force it is designed to work around, and that force, psychological resistance, is both more powerful and more subtle than most people realize. We tend to think of resistance as a conscious choice. Someone tells you what to do, you decide you don't want to, and you push back. Simple enough. But the reality is that most resistance happens long before any conscious decision is made. It happens in the nervous system. It happens in the emotional body. It is a reflexive recoiling that precedes thought. And by the time the thinking mind gets involved, the emotional verdict has already been delivered. This is why you can present someone with the most logically sound argument in the world, and they will still not be moved. Logic and emotion operate on different timescales, and through different channels. You can win the argument completely and still lose the person. And in most real-world situations, losing the person is all that matters. The psychological study of this phenomenon goes back decades. In 1966, two researchers named Jack Bream and Sharon Bream began developing what would become one of the most important theories in social psychology, reactance theory. Their central insight was elegant in its simplicity. When a person perceives that their freedom to choose or act has been threatened or eliminated, they experience a motivational state, reactance, that drives them to restore that freedom. And the way they restore it, most often, is by doing the opposite of what they have been told to do. Notice how precise that is. It is not that they weigh the pros and cons and decide the suggestion is bad. It is not that they have logical objections. It is that the perceived threat to their freedom produces a force inside them that is pointed directly away from the suggested course of action. The stronger the perceived threat, the stronger the reactance. The more insistent the message, the more powerful the pushback. Think about what happens when you put a sign on a wall that says, "Do not touch." Before the sign existed, most people probably would not have thought about touching that wall at all. But the moment the sign appears, a certain percentage of people feel an almost irresistible urge to do exactly that. Not because they particularly wanted to touch the wall, but because the prohibition itself has created a new and very compelling desire. The forbidden becomes the interesting. The denied becomes the desired. This is not irrational behavior. In evolutionary terms, it makes complete sense. A creature that automatically complied with every directive from its environment would be profoundly vulnerable. The capacity to resist, to question, to push back against external control. These are survival mechanisms. They are how our ancestors maintained enough independence to make decisions that kept them alive, even when the social group was wrong. Reactance is not a bug in human psychology. It is a deeply important feature. But of course, in modern life, this feature creates extraordinary complications. We live in a world of relationships, organizations, families, and communities where influence, guidance, and cooperative action are essential. A parent needs to guide a child. A manager needs to direct a team. A doctor needs to change a patient's behavior. A partner needs to communicate needs. And all of these situations involve one person trying, in some way, to shift what another person does or thinks or feels. The challenge is that in almost every one of these situations, The way most people instinctively approach influence activates exactly the reaction they are trying to avoid. We tell, we instruct, we explain, we argue, we repeat. We increase the volume, both literal and metaphorical, and in doing so, we signal, clearly, powerfully, unmistakably, that we are trying to control. And the moment that signal is received, the defenses go up. What is fascinating is that this happens even when people intellectually agree with what is being said. A smoker who genuinely wants to quit will often dig in harder when lectured about smoking. A teenager who has already privately decided to study more will often abandon that intention the moment a parent orders them to study. A person who was leaning toward a particular decision will frequently change course the moment someone tells them that decision is obviously the right one. This is the paradox at the heart of human influence. Certainty repels. Pressure produces opposition. The very force you apply in service of your goal becomes the primary obstacle to achieving it. Understanding this is not just intellectually interesting. It is practically transformative. Because once you see it clearly, once you really internalize the idea that directive communication produces resistance as a systemic, predictable outcome, you stop being surprised by it, and you stop fighting it. Instead, you start asking a much more productive question. What would it look like to communicate in a way that does not trigger reactance at all? The ego plays a central role in all of this, and it is worth pausing to examine that role carefully. When we talk about ego in this context, we are not using it in the psychoanalytic sense of Freud or in the popular sense of arrogance. We are talking about something simpler and more universal, the deeply held sense of self that each person carries, and the powerful need to protect that self from threats. One of the most fundamental threats the ego experiences is the threat of being seen as someone who can be controlled. For most people, the idea of being influenced, directed, manipulated, pushed, carries an implicit insult. It suggests that they are not fully autonomous, not fully capable of determining their own course. And for many people, this suggestion is far more motivating than the actual content of what is being asked. This is why children, who have never shown the slightest interest in something, will suddenly become fiercely determined to have it the moment a parent says they cannot. It is why employees, who were perfectly content in their roles, become deeply dissatisfied the moment they feel micromanaged. It is why people in relationships often want what they have been told they cannot have and lose interest in what they have been aggressively offered. The ego is always listening, and it is always asking the same quiet question: am I free here? Am I in control of my own choices? And the moment the answer to that question starts to feel uncertain, everything else, logic, benefit, evidence, love, becomes secondary to the project of restoring that sense of freedom. There is also the emotional dimension to consider. Resistance is not only a product of ego protection, it is also, often, an emotional response to how the communicating feels, as distinct from what it says. When someone tells us what to do in a tone that feels condescending, dismissive, urgent, or controlling, we respond to the tone before we process the content. The emotional register of the communication shapes our experience of it entirely. This is something that most people who struggle with influence fundamentally underestimate. They focus on the content of their message, what they are saying, and pay relatively little attention to the emotional texture of the delivery. But for the person receiving the message, the emotional texture is often all that registers. Did this person respect me? Did they see me? Did they treat me as someone capable of making my own decisions? Or did they come in with a predetermined conclusion and use me as a vehicle for delivering it? When the answer to that last question is yes, when the communication, however well-intentioned, feels like it is using the other person rather than engaging with them, resistance is the natural, healthy, entirely predictable response. Understanding all of this is the foundation, because reverse psychology, at its most sophisticated, is not really about saying the opposite of what you mean. That is the cartoon version of the concept, and it is the version that is most likely to backfire. The real thing, the deep, effective, ethical version, is about understanding these mechanisms of resistance so completely that you can structure your communication in a way that simply does not activate them. You are not tricking anyone. You are meeting human nature where it is, rather than fighting it. And that shift in approach, from fighting resistance to understanding it, is the beginning of real influence. So what exactly is reverse psychology? The term gets used loosely, often to describe any situation where you suggest the opposite of what you want in order to get what you want. And while that captures a piece of the phenomenon, it misses most of what makes it genuinely interesting and genuinely useful. At its most basic level, reverse psychology is a communication strategy that works by reducing the perceived pressure on the other person, thereby reducing their motivation to resist. Instead of directing someone toward the outcome you want, you either step back from the direction entirely, or you suggest that the opposite of what you want might be acceptable, or even preferable. This creates space. It removes the threat, and in the absence of the threat, the reactant's response has nothing to push against. The result, when it works, is that the other person moves toward the original desired outcome on their own. Not because they were told to, but because the absence of pressure allowed them to evaluate the situation without the distorting influence of ego protection. They choose it, and because they choose it, they are far more committed to it, far more invested in it than they ever would have been had it been handed to them. This is the essential mechanism. But to understand how it actually plays out in practice, we need to look at its many forms, because reverse psychology is less a single technique and more a family of related approaches, all grounded in the same basic understanding of human resistance. The most familiar form is what might be called the permissive statement. Instead of telling someone to do something, you tell them they don't have to. Instead of pushing for the outcome, you give permission for a different one. You don't have to read that book if you don't want to. It's fine if you decide not to come. I understand if this isn't the right time. Each of these statements sounds like a concession, and in a sense it is. But the concession removes the trigger for resistance. And in the absence of resistance, the person is free to consider the situation on its merits, and often finds that the original suggestion was actually quite appealing. A second form is the strategic challenge. This is perhaps the most commonly recognized version, and it works by positioning the desired behavior as something that might be beyond the other person's capacity or interest. I'm not sure this is the kind of thing you'd enjoy. It's pretty difficult. Not everyone can do it. Most people find this challenging. But you might be different. The challenge activates a different motivational system, the desire to prove oneself, to demonstrate capability, to accept rather than avoid difficulty. Used carefully, It shifts the person from passive resistance to active engagement. A third form is the exploratory framing. Instead of presenting a conclusion, you present an open question. I'm not sure what the best approach is here. What do you think? I could be wrong about this. What's your read? There seem to be a few ways to approach this. This form of reverse psychology works because it distributes the cognitive and emotional ownership of the decision. When someone contributes to the process of reaching a conclusion, they have skin in the game. They are no longer being presented with someone else's answer. They are building their own. A fourth form, and one of the most sophisticated, is what might be called the retreat and observe. This is the practice of simply stepping back from the effort to influence at all and waiting to see what happens. When you stop pushing, the person often starts pulling. When the resistance has nothing to push against, it dissipates, and what frequently emerges in that dissipation is genuine curiosity, genuine reconsideration, genuine movement toward the very thing you had been trying to achieve by force. There is a famous story in the behavioral psychology literature about a father who spent months trying to get his teenage son to practice guitar. Every conversation ended in an argument. Every reminder produced eye rolls. Every encouragement was met with sullen silence. Finally, frustrated and exhausted, the father stopped. He didn't stop caring. He didn't stop hoping. He just stopped talking about it. He put the guitar in the living room and left it there. He said nothing. And 3 weeks later, his son started playing, quietly, at first, as if testing the freedom, and then with increasing regularity and passion. The father had tried everything except the one thing that worked, leaving space. This brings us to something important about the nature of desire and motivation. When we are pushed towards something, the push becomes what we are responding to. The actual content, the guitar, the job offer, the new habit, the good advice, gets filtered through the lens of the pressure, and the pressure is what shapes our emotional experience of it. But when the push is removed, the content stands alone. And stripped of the pressure, it often turns out to be genuinely attractive. There is also a deeper principle at work here, one that touches on identity and self-narrative. People do not simply want to do things. They want to be the kind of person who chooses to do things. The distinction is subtle, but profoundly important. When a behavior is assigned to them, when it is imposed by someone else's will, it feels like compliance. And compliance, even when the thing complied to is beneficial, produces a subtle sense of diminishment. But when a behavior is chosen, when it flows from the person's own decision and reflects their own values, it feels like expression. And expression produces a sense of expansion, of authenticity, of wholeness. Reverse psychology, at its best, is the art of creating the conditions for expression rather than compliance. It is the practice of structuring situations so that the other person can arrive at a good choice in a way that feels entirely like their own. Not because you have fooled them, but because you have genuinely understood what they need in order to choose freely, and you have provided it. This is why the most effective practitioners of reverse psychology are not, as popular culture sometimes suggests, cold and calculating manipulators. They are, more often, deeply empathic people who have developed an unusually precise understanding of what makes other people feel controlled and what makes them feel free. And they use that understanding not to exploit those feelings, but to work with them, to create interactions that feel respectful and spacious, even when they are, at some level, carefully designed. The paradox is this: the more skillfully you remove the feeling of being influenced, the more influential you become. The less pressure you apply, the more movement you generate. The more freedom you give, the more power you gain. This is counterintuitive to the point of feeling almost backwards. But it is one of the most consistent findings in the psychology of persuasion, and once you begin to see it in action, it becomes one of the most reliable tools you have. It is also worth noting that reverse psychology, understood this way, is not really a trick. It is a truth. The truth is that people make better decisions when they feel free. The truth is that autonomy is not just a preference, but a requirement for genuine engagement. The truth is that a choice made under pressure is not really a choice at all. It is a performance of compliance, and it tends to dissolve the moment the pressure lifts. Whereas a choice made freely, with full ownership, has staying power. It becomes part of the person's identity. It generates intrinsic motivation. It lasts. So in a very real sense, when you use reverse psychology to give someone the space to choose for themselves, you are not bypassing their agency. You are honoring it. You are doing the deeper work of making genuine choice possible, which is, ultimately, what good influence has always been about. Let us enter a story now, not a story about someone who succeeded by being clever, but a story about someone who tried everything the wrong way first, and what that cost them. Her name was Diane. She was 43 years old, had been managing people for 15 years, and by every external measure, she was good at her job. Her projects came in on time. Her reports were accurate. Her clients trusted her. She had a reputation in her organization as someone who got things done, and she had built that reputation through a combination of competence, energy, and a very clear sense of what needed to happen in any given situation. The problem was that she also had a very clear sense of what needed to happen, and she communicated that clarity in ways that were starting to fracture the team around her. It began with Marcus, a young analyst who had joined her department 18 months earlier. Marcus was talented. Everyone could see it, including Diane. He had a sharp mind, good instincts, and an unusual ability to see patterns in data that other people missed. He was exactly the kind of person Diane wanted on her team, and exactly the kind of person she wanted to develop. So she started guiding him closely. She told him which approaches to take on analysis. She redirected his work when it departed from her preferred methodology. She pointed out, with what she considered helpful directness, when his thinking was off track. She scheduled regular check-ins, twice a week, then 3 times, to review his progress and make sure he was developing in the right direction. At first, Marcus was engaged and responsive. He asked questions, took notes, incorporated her feedback. But gradually, something shifted. The questions became less frequent. The notes became less detailed, and in a change that Diane initially attributed to growing confidence, he started producing work that was technically correct, but strangely flat. The spark that had made him interesting in the first place. The creative leaps, the unexpected angles, seemed to have gone quiet. She responded by increasing her guidance, more check-ins, more detailed feedback, more explicit direction about what she was looking for. And the more she gave, the more Marcus seemed to recede. His outputs became safer, more conventional, more clearly designed to meet her expectations rather than to solve the actual problem. He was performing competence rather than exercising it. Diane did not see this happening in real time. She was too close to it and too committed to her approach to notice that her management style was the cause of the very flatness she was trying to correct. She saw a capable analyst who was not reaching his potential, and she responded by providing more of the structure she believed was missing. She could not yet see that the structure was the problem. The situation came to a head during a quarterly presentation. Marcus had been tasked with presenting a market analysis to a senior leadership team, and Diane had worked with him extensively to prepare it. She had, in effect, shaped almost every aspect of the presentation: the framing, the key findings, the narrative arc, the conclusion. She had done this, she told herself, because the stakes were high and she wanted him to succeed. The presentation was technically flawless. It was clear, logical, and well supported, and it landed with a faint, unmistakable thud. One of the senior leaders, a woman named Patricia, who had a gift for cutting through surfaces to essentials, leaned forward after Marcus had finished and said something that stayed with Diane for a long time afterward. She said, "This is very clean, but I can't quite tell what you think about it." The room waited. Marcus looked at Diane, then back at Patricia, and said, "What I think?" "Yes," Patricia said. "You've shown us the data. Now tell us what you actually believe it means." And Marcus, who had spent the last 18 months learning to produce exactly what Diane wanted, found that he did not have a ready answer. Not because he lacked the intelligence to have one, but because the habit of thinking for himself in that context had, slowly and without anyone noticing, atrophied. After the meeting, Diane sat alone in her car for a long time. She was not angry at Marcus. She was not angry at Patricia. She was turning over the question in her own mind, and the answer she kept arriving at was uncomfortable. She had wanted to help Marcus succeed. She had poured enormous energy and attention into guiding him. She had been clear, consistent, and thorough. And the result of all of that effort was a young analyst who had learned to look to her for answers, rather than generate them himself. She had not developed him. She had, in some important sense, replaced him, replaced his thinking with her thinking, his instincts with her preferences, his voice with her voice. And now, when he needed his own voice, it was not immediately available. This is the arc of the failed direct approach. It is almost never a story of bad intentions. The people who fall into this pattern are often the most competent and most caring people in a room. They see clearly, they care deeply, and they respond to that combination by doing more guiding, more correcting, more shaping. They give more feedback, provide more structure, offer more direction. And all of that more produces less initiative, less creativity, less ownership, less authentic engagement. Diane tried to have a direct conversation with Marcus about it. She told him she wanted him to bring more of his own perspective to his work. She said explicitly, "I want you to trust your instincts more." And Marcus nodded and said he understood, and produced the next analysis in exactly the same careful, meet the manager's expectations way he had been doing for months. Because the problem was not that Marcus didn't know. He was supposed to think independently. The problem was that 18 months of close management had trained his nervous system to operate in a particular way, to seek external validation before committing to a direction, to defer to Diane's judgment as the reference standard, to define good work as work that Diane approved of. You cannot undo that kind of training by saying its opposite. You can only undo it by changing the actual conditions that created it. Diane also tried being more explicit about her vision for his development. She had a conversation in which she laid out a clear growth path for Marcus. Here is where you are now. Here is where I see you in 2 years. Here are the skills I want you to develop. She was articulate and detailed, and clearly well-intentioned, and Marcus thanked her warmly and felt, in some quiet corner of himself, slightly more trapped than he had before, because now the future she envisioned for him had been named and defined and handed to him. And the question of whether it was the future he actually wanted had been rendered almost irrelevant. The path had been drawn. All that remained was to walk it, and Diane, watching his response, felt the faint, disquieting sense that something she was doing was not working, even though she could not yet name what it was. This is the pattern. The direct approach, applied with greater and greater intensity, produces diminishing returns. The person being managed begins to operate as a responder rather than an initiator. Their engagement becomes reactive. They react to what is asked of them, rather than acting from their own inner drive. And the more skilled the manager becomes at directing, the more comprehensively this reactive posture is reinforced. What Diane needed was not a different strategy for directing Marcus. What she needed was to stop directing him, to create a kind of managed vacuum, a deliberate withdrawal of guidance. That would draw him back into his own authority. She needed, in other words, the exact opposite of everything she had been doing. Not because the opposite was intrinsically better, but because the original approach had created a specific kind of deficit that could only be filled by its complement. She did not yet know how to do that, but she was beginning, in the quiet of her car in the parking garage, to understand that something needed to change, and that understanding, imperfect, uncomfortable, tinged with the specific embarrassment of a capable person recognizing a capable person's mistake, was the beginning of a much more interesting approach. The story of Diane and Marcus illustrates something that goes well beyond the specifics of management. It illustrates a principle about human motivation and engagement that applies wherever one person is trying to influence another. The more you fill a space, the less room there is for the other person to occupy it, and people need to occupy their own space in order to function at their best. Indirect influence works on an entirely different principle. Rather than filling space, it creates space. Rather than providing answers, it provokes questions. Rather than directing attention toward a conclusion, it positions the landscape in such a way that the person's natural attention and curiosity leads them there. The difference is not subtle. It is the difference between pulling and pushing, between opening a door and carrying someone through it. And the results, in terms of engagement, ownership, and sustained motivation, are profoundly different. Consider the way skilled therapists approach their work. A good therapist almost never tells a client what to do. They do not deliver verdicts, issue directions, or prescribe conclusions. What they do instead is ask questions. Carefully chosen, precisely placed questions that illuminate aspects of the client's own experience that the client has not fully examined. They create conditions for insight rather than delivering insight, and the insights that emerge through this process are owned entirely by the client. They are not borrowed from the therapist's worldview. They are excavated from the client's own, and this ownership is not incidental to the healing. It is the healing itself. A similar dynamic operates in the best teaching. There is a form of instruction, familiar to anyone who has experienced it, in which the teacher essentially performs competence for the student, explains concepts, demonstrates solutions, provides answers. The student watches, takes notes, and learns, in a narrow sense, the content of what is being taught. But there is a deeper form of instruction in which the teacher withholds the answer deliberately, asks questions instead of giving explanations, creates problems rather than solving them, and waits, patiently, with full confidence in the student's capacity, for the student to work through to their own understanding. The learning that comes from this deeper form is slower. It is often more frustrating, and it is incomparably more durable. In both of these examples, the power of the approach lies in what it does not do. It does not presume to know what the other person needs better than they do. It does not impose a path. It creates a field in which the other person can move, think, discover, and ultimately choose. And the choosing is what makes everything else real. This principle translates directly into the practice of indirect influence in everyday communication. When you approach a conversation not with an agenda to implement, but with a genuine curiosity about what the other person is thinking and feeling, something shifts in the quality of the interaction. The other person feels it. They relax in a way that is almost physical. The defensiveness softens. The reactance has nothing to attach to, because there is no pressure to push against. And in that relaxed, undefended state, people are remarkably open to influence. Not because they have been manipulated into it, but because the natural human appetite for connection, understanding, and good decision-making is no longer being suppressed by the need to protect against control. There is also a powerful dynamic that operates when you express genuine uncertainty rather than confidence. Certainty, in social contexts, is often experienced as a kind of aggression, not literally aggressive, not physically threatening, but ego-threatening. When you are certain, you implicitly position the other person as someone who needs to be convinced, which is a subtle but real form of condescension. But when you express genuine uncertainty, you position them as a potential contributor to a shared inquiry. And people respond to that positioning very differently. "I'm not sure what the right approach here is," creates a fundamentally different interaction than, "I think you should do this." The first statement opens a conversation. The second statement opens a negotiation, and often, a resistance. The first invites engagement. The second invites evaluation. Indirect influence also works powerfully through what might be called the principle of strategic observation. This is the practice of noticing and commenting on behavior rather than directing it. Instead of telling someone what you want them to do, you observe something true about what they are already doing. "I notice you seem really engaged when you're working on the creative side of these projects," is not a directive. It is a reflection. But a carefully chosen reflection, offered at the right moment, can orient a person toward a part of themselves that they value. And from that reorientation, new choices often emerge naturally. This is how great coaches work. They do not tell athletes what to do. They help athletes see themselves more clearly. And in that clearer seeing, the athlete often discovers capacities and inclinations that they can then choose to develop. The choice is theirs. The coach has simply made it more visible. What all of these approaches share is a fundamental respect for the other person's agency. They are grounded in the belief, not just the intellectual acknowledgement, but the genuine, felt belief that the other person is capable of making good decisions if given the right conditions. And that belief, when it is real, communicates itself in ways that no technique can replicate. This is the deepest truth about indirect influence. It works best when it is grounded in genuine respect, not performed respect, not strategic respect, real, actual, deeply felt respect for the other person's autonomy, intelligence, and capacity. When that is present, even the most carefully designed communication feels like care rather than manipulation. Because that is what it is. Now we need to spend some time on what might be the most important part of this entire conversation: the ethics of using reverse psychology, and the question of what separates ethical influence from manipulation. This distinction is not always as clear as people would like it to be. There is a tempting desire to draw a bright line. Here is manipulation, here is influence, and never the twain shall meet. But the reality is messier than that. Almost any communication strategy can be used manipulatively. Kindness can be weaponized. Honesty can be deployed as a form of cruelty. The question of ethics in influence is less about the techniques used and more about the intention, the context, and the relationship in which they operate. That said, there are some meaningful distinctions that are worth drawing carefully. Manipulation at its core involves a fundamental misalignment between the manipulator's stated or apparent purpose and their actual purpose. The manipulator presents one thing while pursuing another. They use the relationship, the trust, the affection, the vulnerability, as a resource to be extracted rather than a connection to be honored. The goal of manipulation is, by definition, to get something from the other person at the other person's expense. Even when the outcome might be objectively beneficial, manipulation bypasses the other person's actual decision-making process in a way that treats them as a means rather than an end. Ethical influence, by contrast, operates in full awareness of and respect for the other person's interests. The influencer may not always share their strategy explicitly, and as we will discuss, there are situations where strategic transparency actually defeats the purpose. But the goal is genuinely aligned with the other person's well-being. The outcome being pursued is one that is actually good for them, or at the very least, not harmful to them. And the approach preserves, rather than erodes, their genuine autonomy. The distinction can sometimes be subtle, but it tends to show up clearly in two specific places. The first is in the question of benefit. Whose interests does this influence primarily serve? Is this an attempt to guide someone towards something that is genuinely good for them? Good for their health, their relationships, their growth, their well-being? Or is it an attempt to extract compliance, resources, or behavior that primarily serves the influencer? The person trying to get their child to eat vegetables is working in the child's interest. The person using emotional pressure to get a partner to apologize is working in their own interest. The technique might look similar in both cases, but the underlying orientation is fundamentally different. The second place the distinction shows up is in the question of what would happen if the strategy were disclosed. If you were to explain, in full transparency, what you were doing and why, if you were to say to the other person, "I am structuring this conversation in a way that I hope will allow you to arrive at this conclusion more freely," would they feel respected or betrayed? If they would feel respected, if they would nod and say, "Yes, I understand why you did it that way, and I appreciate the care," then you are in the territory of ethical influence. if they would feel manipulated, used, or deceived. You are in something else entirely. This is not to say that ethical influence must always be fully transparent in real time. A therapist does not interrupt every session to explain their methodology. A skilled communicator does not narrate their approach as they deploy it. The strategy is implicit in the execution, and that is fine. But the approach must be one that, if disclosed, would be acceptable to the other person. It must pass what we might call the disclosure test. There is also a question of consistency and relationship health over time. Influence that erodes trust, that creates a pattern of the other person feeling obscurely unsatisfied without knowing why, that produces compliance but not genuine buy-in. This is a failure not just of ethics but of effectiveness, because sustainable influence requires trust, and trust requires transparency, respect, and the consistent experience of being treated as an intelligent, autonomous person whose choices are genuinely respected. Using reverse psychology responsibly, then, means several things. It means being clear in your own mind about what you actually want, and why, and whether that want is genuinely aligned with the other person's interests. It means choosing approaches that preserve the other person's sense of agency rather than eroding it. It means being willing, at least in principle, to let the other person choose differently. To accept that genuine autonomy includes the possibility of a different outcome than the one you were hoping for. And perhaps most importantly, it means doing the ongoing work of examining your own motivations. The line between carrying influence and self-serving manipulation is not always visible from the outside. It is only reliably visible from within, and it requires a level of honest self-examination that is, frankly, harder than any technique. The best influencers are people who have developed a very sophisticated understanding of themselves. They know what they want. They know why they want it. They know when their desire to influence is in service of the other person and when it is in service of themselves. And they use that self-knowledge to stay on the right side of a line that is always worth paying attention to. Reverse psychology is not equally effective in all situations, and part of using it well is developing a clear sense of where it is likely to work and where it is not. The most fertile ground for this approach is anywhere that reactance is already high. People who are naturally high in what psychologists call trait reactance. People who place exceptional value on their autonomy, who are especially sensitive to feeling controlled, who have a strong and readily activated need to be seen as independent, are the people with whom indirect approaches are most dramatically superior to direct ones. With these individuals, direct instruction is almost always counterproductive. The more clearly you state what you want, the more clearly they feel the need to assert their independence from that desire. But offer them space, withdraw the pressure, hint that the choice might not be right for them, and they will often move toward it with a speed and enthusiasm that can be surprising. Adolescents are perhaps the clearest example of this profile. The adolescent developmental stage is, in many ways, defined by the project of establishing autonomous identity, of becoming a self that is distinct from parents, family, and childhood. This makes teenagers exquisitely sensitive to anything that feels like an attempt to control them, and correspondingly responsive to approaches that honor their autonomy. Parents who have discovered this tend to find that their influence with their teenagers actually increases when they stop trying so hard to exert it. High Achieving high autonomy professionals are another group where indirect influence tends to outperform direct. People who have built careers on the strength of their independent judgment are generally not well served by being told what to do. They know what they know, they trust their own thinking, and they experience direct direction as an implicit challenge to their competence. Approaches that engage their thinking, rather than bypassing it, that invite them to contribute to conclusions, rather than simply receive them, tend to produce much stronger engagement and ownership. People in states of active resistance are another natural fit. When someone is already dug in, already arguing, already defensive, already committed to their current position, continuing to apply pressure in the same direction is rarely productive. The resistance has been activated, the ego is engaged, and more of the same will produce more of the same. But a shift in approach, a withdrawal of pressure, an expression of genuine openness, a surprising acknowledgement that their position has merit, can sometimes dissolve the resistance in ways that feel almost magical, simply because it was not the thing they were braced for. Situations involving significant emotional stakes are also good candidates for indirect approaches. When someone is making a decision about something that matters to them deeply, a career change, a relationship, a major purchase, a health choice, the emotional charge of the situation means that any perceived pressure will be amplified. The stakes make them more, not less, vigilant about their autonomy. Gentle, unhurried, genuinely open communication tends to work far better here than any attempt to drive a conclusion. On the other side of the ledger, there are situations where indirect influence is less appropriate or less effective. Clear emergencies are one. When someone is in immediate danger, when the situation requires direct, urgent action, and there is no time for the luxury of autonomous choice architecture, directness is not only appropriate, but necessary. Get out of the building now is not a moment for exploratory framing. Situations where the power differential is too significant are another. When there is a large imbalance of power, when one person has strong authority over another, indirect approaches can sometimes read as passive-aggressive or as playing games, rather than as respectful communication. A leader who refuses to give clear direction in situations that genuinely require it, in the name of honoring autonomy, is not being respectful. They are being avoidant. Clear, direct communication is sometimes the most respectful thing you can offer. People who are operating from a place of genuine confusion, rather than resistance, also often need direct input, rather than indirect. When someone genuinely does not know what they want, or genuinely lacks the information to make a good decision, creating more space does not help them. What they need is more information, more clarity, more direct engagement with the options. Indirect influence is most powerful when the other person has the capacity to choose well, if given the freedom to do so. It is less useful when what they need is not freedom but clarity. Finally, there are people for whom highly indirect communication feels like dishonesty or evasion. These individuals, often highly direct themselves, often with strong values around straightforwardness, may actually experience gentle, indirect approaches as disrespectful. They want to know what you think, what you want, what you are trying to accomplish. And for them, the most honoring thing you can do is tell them directly, trusting them to handle it and to make their own choice in response. Part of reading people well is developing the ability to sense which kind of person you are dealing with and adjusting your approach accordingly. Reverse psychology is not a universal solution. It is a tool with a specific profile of conditions under which it is most effective. Using it well means knowing those conditions and also knowing when to put it down and simply say what you mean. We have talked about what reverse psychology is and how it works. Now let us talk about how it can go wrong, about the specific risks of misuse, and why awareness of those risks is as important as awareness of the technique itself. The most obvious risk is the one that sounds like the entire concept: using reverse psychology manipulatively to engineer outcomes that serve your interests at the other person's expense. This is not really reverse psychology in any meaningful sense. It is just manipulation with an extra step, and it carries all the costs that manipulation always carries: eroded trust, damaged relationships, and the very specific kind of resentment that comes from a person realizing later that they were played. Because people do figure it out. Not always immediately, and not always consciously, but the feeling of having been maneuvered tends to surface, eventually, in ways that compound with time. The person who was nudged into a purchase they didn't really want, or manipulated into a relationship decision that served someone else's agenda, or pushed through subtle pressure toward a conclusion that wasn't actually theirs. These people carry that experience somewhere in their body, even when they can't articulate it, and it affects the quality of every interaction that follows. The subtler risks are, in some ways, more dangerous precisely because they are harder to see. One of them is overuse. Reverse psychology is a powerful tool because it works against the grain of people's normal expectations. When you withdraw pressure in a situation where they expect pressure, the surprise creates an opening. But if you always do this, if indirect approaches become your default mode rather than a carefully chosen one, they lose their novelty and their effectiveness. People calibrate to your patterns, they learn how you operate. And a person who has learned that you habitually use indirect approaches will start to see through them, at which point the technique not only stops working, but actively damages trust. Another subtle risk is the drift toward inauthenticity. Using any sophisticated communication strategy requires a certain degree of deliberateness that, if not grounded in genuine feeling, can create a quality of performance in your interactions. People are exquisitely sensitive to authenticity. They may not be able to articulate exactly what feels off, but they sense the difference between someone who is genuinely engaging with them and someone who is running a strategy. And the sensation of being strategized at, even if the strategy is technically benevolent, produces a discomfort that undermines the relationship. This is why the best version of what we are describing is not really a set of techniques at all. It is a set of values, a genuine orientation toward other people's autonomy, a real curiosity about their inner experience, a true desire to create conditions in which they can choose freely. When those values are genuinely present, the specific approaches that flow from them feel natural, spontaneous, and real rather than calculated, and it is that genuineness that makes them effective in the deepest and most lasting way. A third risk is what might be called the abdication trap. There are situations where the appropriate thing to do is to be direct, where the other person needs honest, clear input, and the most respectful thing you can offer is your actual opinion. Using indirect approaches as a way of avoiding that directness, of dodging the discomfort of saying something the other person might not want to hear, is not wisdom. It is cowardice dressed as sophistication. And the person on the receiving end generally senses it, even if they cannot name it. Finally, there is the risk of losing touch with your own desires and needs in the process of learning to manage others' reactions. A person who is excessively focused on how to avoid triggering resistance may find, over time, that they have lost track of what they actually want and what they actually believe. The practice of influence, when it becomes unmoored from authentic self-expression, tends to hollow out the influencer as much as it bypasses the influenced. The goal is not to become someone who is so attuned to managing other people's reactions that you lose your own voice. The goal is to become someone whose authentic voice is delivered in a way that can actually be heard. Everything we have discussed, the nature of resistance, the mechanics of indirect influence, the ethics of using these tools responsibly, all of it is, at its core, about communication. And communication, understood deeply, is the central skill of human life. We live inside our relationships. We construct our sense of self in dialogue with others. We accomplish almost everything that matters through our interactions with other people. And the quality of those interactions, the degree to which we are able to truly hear and be heard, to influence and be influenced, to connect across the inevitable gap of different minds and different experiences, determines the quality of our lives in ways that are difficult to overstate. The person who understands human resistance and knows how to work with it rather than against it is not just a more effective influencer. They are a more present parent, a more trusted colleague, a more genuinely helpful friend. They are someone whose presence tends to create expansion rather than contraction in the people around them. Someone in whose company others feel, in some way they might not be able to name, more free. This is the real payoff of learning what we are exploring in this book. Not the ability to get people to do specific things, not the tactical advantage in negotiations or arguments. The real payoff is the transformation of the quality of all your relationships. The shift from interactions, defined by competing agendas, to interactions, defined by genuine engagement. From conversations as contests to conversations as collaborations. That transformation begins with listening. Not strategic listening. Not the kind of listening that is really just waiting for the other person to finish so you can respond. But the kind of listening that is genuinely interested in the full texture of what is being communicated. What is the person actually saying? What are they feeling? What do they need that they may not be directly expressing? What is the fear or hope or concern that lives beneath the surface of their words? When you listen at this level, two things happen. First, you gather information that makes your own communication dramatically more effective. You understand what the person actually needs to hear, rather than what you assumed they needed to hear. You see the actual obstacles to the outcome you want, rather than the ones you projected, and you are able to address those actual obstacles in ways that create real movement, rather than just the appearance of movement. But the second thing that happens is, in many ways, more important than the first. When you listen at this level, the other person feels heard, and feeling genuinely heard is one of the most powerful experiences a human being can have. It is rare enough that it creates a strong and immediate impression. People who feel heard lower their defenses. They become more open, more flexible, more willing to consider perspectives that differ from their own. The reactance that would otherwise require so much skill to navigate simply does not appear, because the conditions that generate it, the feeling of not being seen, of being treated as a recipient rather than a full person, are not present. This is not a technique. It is a way of being, and it produces results that no technique can replicate, because the other person is responding not to what you did, but to who you are. They are responding to the experience of being genuinely met. Understanding human behavior also improves communication by expanding your range. Most people operate with a relatively narrow repertoire of communication styles. They have one or two modes: direct and confident, or gentle and accommodating, or analytical and structured. And they apply those modes in almost every situation. But different situations and different people require different approaches. The person who is capable of being direct when directness is called for, gentle when gentleness is needed, curious when exploration serves better than conclusion, and firm when firmness is necessary, that person is capable of genuinely meeting the full range of human situations. Building that range requires developing a kind of observational fluency, the ability to read situations accurately, to see what is actually happening in an interaction rather than what you expected to happen, is something that can be cultivated. It comes from paying attention to the nonverbal as much as the verbal, to the energy in the room, the quality of eye contact, the small physical signs of engagement or withdrawal, to the things that are not said as much as the things that are, to the history and context that every interaction carries, even when that history is not explicitly present in the conversation. It also requires a certain willingness to be wrong about people. The assumptions we carry about how specific individuals will respond to specific approaches are always approximations. People surprise us. They are more complex, more variable, more contextually sensitive than any mental model can capture. The willingness to be surprised, to notice when someone's response does not match your expectation, and to update your understanding accordingly, is a mark of genuine communication intelligence. And it requires, finally, the willingness to sit with discomfort. Real communication, the kind that actually reaches people, often involves saying difficult things, tolerating difficult reactions, staying present in the face of resistance, and holding space for a process that does not resolve quickly or neatly. The temptation to smooth things over, to rush to resolution, to avoid the discomfort of genuine engagement. This temptation is powerful, and giving in to it consistently produces the most common communication failure there is: interactions that feel fine and accomplish nothing. The people who communicate well have developed a tolerance for that discomfort. They have learned that the awkward pause, the uncertain moment, the conversation that stays in productive difficulty rather than collapsing into premature agreement. These are signs of something real happening, and they have learned to stay in those moments and to trust that staying is, ultimately, the most powerful thing they can do. Let us return to Diane. It has been 6 months since the presentation that shook her. 6 months in which she has been thinking differently, watching more carefully, and trying something she has never consciously tried before getting out of the way. It did not begin dramatically. It began with a small experiment. She had a standing meeting with Marcus on Tuesday afternoons. She had always structured these meetings around specific questions she wanted to answer and specific feedback she wanted to give. But for the Tuesday after the parking garage realization, she came in with nothing. No agenda, no prepared feedback, no list of things she wanted to address. She sat down across from him and said, "I thought we could use this time differently today. Instead of me going through things, I'd like to know what's on your mind about the work." Marcus looked at her for a moment with an expression she could only describe as carefully non-committal. He was checking to see if this was a test. She smiled. "I mean it. I'm genuinely curious." What followed was one of the longer pauses in the history of their working relationship. Marcus looked at the table. He looked at his hands, and then slowly he began to talk. He talked about a data pattern he had been noticing in one of the long-term client accounts, a pattern that he had not flagged in any of his reports because it was subtle and somewhat speculative, and he had not been sure it met the standard for what Diane was looking for. He described it carefully, with the specific kind of hesitation of someone who is used to editing themselves before speaking. But as he talked, something started to happen. The hesitation softened. The language became more precise, more confident, more alive. He started drawing a connection between the pattern and a sector trend that he had been following in his personal reading, something outside the scope of his official work. Diane listened. She asked one question, a small one, not to redirect but to understand. And the question opened another door, and Marcus walked through it. By the end of the meeting, he had laid out the outline of an analysis that was, Diane recognized, with something between pride and chagrin, significantly more interesting than anything he had produced in the previous year. It was genuinely his thinking, creative, unexpected, willing to go somewhere uncertain. It was what she had been trying to produce from him for 18 months, through every technique of direct guidance she knew. She had not produced it through any of those techniques. She had produced it by stopping. In the weeks that followed, Diane experimented further. She started asking Marcus questions she did not know the answers to, and waiting genuinely for his response rather than steering toward her own. She started saying, in meetings, "I'm not sure. What do you think?" and meaning it. When he came to her with problems, instead of immediately offering solutions, she started asking what he had already considered, and then asking what he thought about the options he had outlined. The changes were not dramatic at first, but they were consistent, and over time, something accumulated in the quality of Marcus's work and in the quality of their relationship. He started volunteering perspectives in team meetings where he had previously been quiet. He started flagging potential issues early, rather than waiting to see if they materialized. He started pushing back on conclusions he disagreed with, including, occasionally, conclusions of Diane's own, in ways that were thoughtful and substantive, rather than reflexively resistant. The last thing that happened, 6 months in, was the moment Diane recognized as a real turning point. Marcus came to her with a proposal for an analysis he wanted to conduct. One that was not on any list, had not been assigned, and was not related to any current project. He had developed it himself, on his own time, and he had come to her not for permission or for guidance, but simply to share it, in the way you share something with someone you trust. She read the proposal and told him, honestly, that it was excellent. And then she said something that she had not planned to say, that came out of a genuine place of recognition. "I should have trusted you more, a year ago. I didn't see what I was doing." Marcus looked at her for a moment, and then he said, with a directness that felt like something earned, "I appreciate that. It makes a difference, knowing you see it. That conversation was not reverse psychology. It was not any kind of technique at all. It was two people, in a restored relationship, being honest with each other. But the conversation would not have been possible without everything which had led to it. Without Diane's willingness to try something different, to withdraw rather than advance, to create space rather than fill it. The technique had served its purpose. It had made room for something real. We have come a long way from the opening image, the person across the table, the reasonable request, the inexplicable no. We have traveled through the architecture of resistance, the mechanics of reactance, the ethics of influence, and the human realities of how communication succeeds and fails. And we arrive now at something that feels, in some ways, like the simplest idea of all. True influence is not about control. It is about understanding. This bears sitting with, because it is easy to read and hard to really absorb. We live in a world that treats influence as a form of force, as something you apply to others in order to move them. And this model is so embedded in how we think about power and agency that most of us never question it. The effective person, in this model, is the one whose force is strongest, whose arguments are sharpest, whose will is most consistent, the one who does not back down, the one who makes it happen. But the research and the lived experience of people who actually develop profound influence over time tells a very different story. The most genuinely influential people are not, typically, the most forceful. They are the most attuned. They are people who have developed an extraordinarily refined ability to sense what others need, what they fear, what they want, what will open them and what will close them. And from that sensing, they communicate in ways that meet people where they actually are rather than where they are supposed to be. This attunement is not a passive quality. It is not softness or accommodation or the absence of strong views. The most influential people often have very strong views and very clear senses of direction. But they hold those views and that direction in a way that remains open to the actual human being in front of them. They are not wedded to the path at the expense of the traveler. They can adjust, recalibrate, take a different route, because they understand that the goal is not to prove the path, but to reach the destination. When people feel free to choose, they are more likely to act. This is perhaps the most practically important insight in this entire book, and it is worth saying plainly. The action that flows from genuine choice is incomparably more powerful, more sustained, and more committed than the action that flows from compliance. When you choose something, it becomes part of you. You defend it, invest in it, build on it. When you comply with something, it remains external to you. You perform it when required and abandon it when you can. This means that every time you create the conditions for genuine choice. Every time you step back from direction and make room for someone to arrive at a conclusion themselves. You are not just increasing your short-term influence. You are building something that lasts. You are planting something in the other person's identity that will continue to grow even when you are not in the room. And when you respect that, when your influence is grounded in a genuine respect for the other person's autonomy, when you are willing to accept a different outcome in service of their genuine freedom, your influence becomes stronger, not weaker, not immediately perhaps, not in the specific transaction, but over time, across the full arc of a relationship, across the compounding of thousands of interactions. A person who has always been free in your presence will trust you more deeply than anyone who ever drove them toward compliance. They will come to you. They will listen to you. They will tell you things they do not tell others, because your presence does not feel like a threat to their autonomy. It feels like an expansion of it. This is the quiet pull, not the dramatic force of assertion or the visible power of command. The quiet pull of a presence that makes others feel free and capable and seen, that asks rather than commands, invites rather than directs, and trusts rather than controls. There is something almost paradoxical about ending a book on influence by talking about how little it has to do with trying to influence people. But that paradox is precisely the point. The desperate need to control outcomes, to make things happen, to ensure that others do what we believe they should do. This need is more often an obstacle to genuine influence than a pathway to it. It signals something to others that they respond to long before they process any specific message. It signals that we do not fully trust them, that we are not fully present with them, that we have an agenda for this interaction that is more important to us than their actual experience of it. The release of that desperate need, the willingness to show up without an agenda, to be genuinely curious, to make room for outcomes you did not plan. This is not passivity. It is the most active and demanding form of presence there is. It requires enormous security in yourself. It requires the capacity to tolerate uncertainty. It requires a kind of faith in human nature that has to be renewed, again and again, in the face of all the evidence that human nature sometimes disappoints. But it is also, ultimately, the thing that works, not because of any psychological trick, but because it is true. People do make better choices when they feel free. They do perform better when they feel trusted. They do open up when they feel safe. These are not assumptions or theories. They are some of the most consistently replicated findings in all of social science, and they confirm something that most of us sense, somewhere beneath all the anxiety about influence and control. The way you treat people is the most powerful message you ever send them. Treat people as capable of making their own good choices, and they tend to make them. Treat people as needing to be directed and corrected and monitored, and they tend to need exactly the direction and correction and monitoring you give them. Not because they are dependent, but because your treatment of them has become part of the environment they are responding to. So the final practice, if there is one, is this: notice, in your next important conversation, how much of your energy is focused on moving the other person toward a predetermined destination, and how much is focused on genuinely being with them, wherever they are. Notice the pull toward your agenda and the impulse to override their resistance. Notice what it would feel like to let that go, just for a moment, just to see, and simply show up without knowing in advance where you would arrive. That is not weakness. That is the most sophisticated form of strength there is. And more often than you might expect, the person across from you, free at last from the pressure that had been making them push back, will look up and take a breath and move exactly where you were hoping they would go. Not because you made them, because you trusted them to find it.